said that you're not calling for the slaughter of white people, at least for now. Would you pledge never to call for the killing of white people? And he says, I'll do it. Now, I could have stopped at that point and said, okay. So I said, oh, all right, well, you've said that you'll do this in principle, so will you do it now? And then he says, no, I refuse. So once I'd gotten that answer, it's damning.
Kill the Boer. Afrikaners are cowards. These are the statements, and some of the best legal opinions would be from guest here, Advocate Mark Oppenheimer. So, Mark, let's start with Ramaphosa calling Afrikaners cowards. What do you think is his mindset there, and how do you think this all relates to the entire hate speech issue here in South Africa?
Yeah, I think it's a truly dismal situation that people feel that they are being driven out of the country. And I think they have good reason to feel that they need to seek refuge in another country. Part of it goes to the horrendous nature of farm attacks. During the Kill the Boer litigation, we led evidence from people who had survived these attacks. And the trauma of those experiences is so extreme. I mean, the kinds of things that happen to people, having their knees drilled, being tied up for hours, having swords thrust down their necks, being raped, being brutalized to death, often in situations where there's almost no financial reason for it. So sometimes there'll be a theft where a car gets stolen and then abandoned just down the road, or very small amounts of money are taken. In one of the cases, a mother and daughter were so brutally murdered with broken bottles that it was unclear whether the daughter had also been raped, and Kill the Boer was written in blood above their bodies. So you also have the situation where the nature of the attacks is so extreme, but also the ratios of intruder attacks on farms are so different from the rest of what we have in South Africa. So there's a general narrative that South Africa is a crime-ridden place, everybody experiences crime, and just because some white farmers get it in the neck doesn't mean that there's a problem. So the way to understand whether there's a problem is not just to look at raw numbers, it's to look at ratios. So to give you an idea, the general murder rate in South Africa is about 33 out of 100,000. But that's a distortion. So when we think murders, we think that must all be intruder attacks. But actually only about 5 out of the 33 are intruder attacks. A lot of it is social fabric crimes, gang violence, domestic violence. Farm attacks, by definition, are all intruder attacks. And there, the ratio for farmer murders is 100 out of 100,000. So 20 times higher than our intruder attack rate. So there's a serious concern. One way that people have tried to rubbish the concern is to say there are allegations of white genocide in South Africa, there's no white genocide, therefore we don't need to talk about farm murders. Now, I think all reasonable actors in South Africa say there is no white genocide, but that doesn't mean there isn't a problem with people being attacked on the grounds of their race in these brutal ways. And the kinds of recommendations that are being made on this front are actually all very reasonable. Saying, okay, look, we have priority crimes for other things like copper cable theft or rhino poaching. It's quite difficult to police rural attacks because of the scale of the farms.
Yeah.
So you should make them priority crimes. You should allow for something like the commando system to come back. You should allow communities to be able to look after themselves. These are not radical things. So instead what you have is someone like Ramaphosa saying there are no farm murders of white people, so the denial. And then when people say, well, we're not protected by the courts, Kill the Boer case is run, it's run in 3 courts, really. And, the equality courts, the court finds that the meaning of Kill the Boer is actually a protest song by the EFF against the ANC government for their failures in land reform. That is the finding of the equality court. By the way, a poll was recently done to find out what most South Africans thought, and a variety of different views was put forward. That one ranked last.
Yeah, I think also the Social Research Foundation did a poll on EFF voters, and like 90% said they don't agree or they don't like it or something like that.
Yes, yeah, even among EFF voters, a lot of them sort of distanced themselves from the song or saw it as a sincere attack. So the Supreme Court of Appeal sort of also had an unusual take on what the song meant, and the Constitutional Court refused to even hear it. So those that are seeking refuge are not cowards. They are people who probably love this country, and have shed many tears about having to give up their lives here to move to another country.
Probably very brave.
I would think it's very brave. My grandparents fled Nazi Germany in the 30s, and it's a horrible thing to have to leave your friends, your family, your job, your property, and then to take a gamble in a new country where you don't know how you're going to be treated, where you don't speak the language necessarily. My grandparents, arrived speaking German, and you're going to have some hostility directed at them by some of the mainstream press in America. You've got the Episcopalian Church saying, we're going to end our cooperation over refugees because white farmers are being let in, and we think this is contrary to racial justice.
Oh, wow.
So you've got, the Episcopalians are the kind of equivalent of the Anglicans, and they mentioned their close roots with the Anglican Church in South Africa. And so on that basis, not only will they not help these people, they will not help any refugees anymore ever over this incident. I mean, that's a crazy thing to do. If you look at some of the way that those refugees are described by the New York Times or NPR, it's in despicable terms. It's to sort of say, these people are the descendants of colonizers. They're responsible for apartheid somehow, and they shouldn't be let in because they're white, without any sense of going, what did these people go through? Like, there's a reason why people are willing to, shatter their lives, to try and seek safety abroad. And it's a very callous thing to sort of say, we don't think that you're legitimate based on the color of your skin. And then for a Ramaphosa to sort of add salt into the wounds by calling them cowards is really a shameful thing to do. And then also a very bad tactical thing to do. So, Ramaphosa will be heading off to the States and having a meeting with Trump.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see that White House set up if the two of them go to each other.
Yes, I imagine it goes in a couple of ways. The one is we're going to see Zelensky Part 2, Electric Boogaloo, which
I would love it if that happened.
Yeah, that Ramaphosa will be very publicly grilled. The other one is that he gets a 15-minute meeting and it's sort of fobbed off and not taken very seriously. I think as soon as he says the words like, I'm here to explain why you've misunderstood what's going on in South Africa, they're going to say, lovely seeing you. I think you need to get back on a plane.
Yes.
I think this sort of claim of a mass misinformation, disinformation campaign just reeks of Soviet-style propaganda. This is a sort of line that you're seeing echoed from the government and from outlets like News 24. You'd expect when an organization says, these claims are false, that you would identify the claims, you would explain why they're false, and you would have some evidence to back it up. That's not what we're seeing. We're just sort of seeing this wholesale sort of claim of disinformation. I mean, the most hilarious version of this, of course, is Peter Toy from News 24 going on Lorenz Eckart's show on CakeNet and debating Willy Spies over Twatabas. And he holds up a sign. And Peter Toy will never sleep comfortably at night after holding up that sign because he's been memed to death very deservedly. But he holds up a sign with this graph. And he says the graph is population growth from 1910 till 2016 along racial groups. And he says this is disinformation. Now, of course, what's incredibly embarrassing for Mr. DeToy is that the source of that graph is News 24 itself, because they ran an article in 2017 where they used that graph. When your line is, don't trust this graph, and then you don't say that it emanates from you, and then when asked about it by Pretoria News, he sort of says, well, no, our graphs are different because, it has 3 years less data, but the trend lines are basically identical.
It's also a very shaky argument that he sort of made in an interview, sort of, okay, this guy said bad things. Now we're going to, what's the term, unmask, contact details, everything. Dox, is that the term? If you apply that principle broadly, how many people should you then be doxing? Why focus on this specific one person? That's this argument that Willy Spies made in that interview.
What's interesting is James Marburg from Politics Web pointed this out as well. And the response from Adrian Basson was to say, well, you wouldn't complain if we were writing an article about Paul Mashatile, so what's the problem? It's like, okay, Paul Mashatile is the deputy president. First of all, everybody knows who he is, you're not revealing any private information about the guy. You're holding them to account for corrupt dealings. This is a private citizen, and what you're trying to do is reveal information about where he lives, where his parents live, where their business is, and you're inviting a mob of hateful people to destroy his life. The guy's in hiding. That is a very different thing, and the fact that News 24 doesn't understand that distinction is just horrifying.
Do you think so? Do you think they don't understand, or is there, I don't know, pay to make as if they don't understand it?
Interesting. I mean, the paid line, one of the biggest investors in News 24 is the Public Investment Corporation, right? So, which is, a state investment fund. So there is a sense in which if you are a for-profit business like News 24, you're not in the game of saying, we're a charity who wants to educate the world about what's going on. You've got investors, you've got paid subscribers. Those financial influences are going to play a role in which stories you cover. I mean, they set up a special disinformation desk, which basically only focuses on like claims made by Solidarity and AfriForum. And you think, that's interesting. Yeah, that's where we're most concerned about untruths coming from. Not from the state, not from the fact that we've got like almost no accountability from the Zondo Commission. Like, yeah, these civil rights organizations, AfriForum being the biggest on the continent, yeah, that's where the real problems are. And then no real effort to address the actual claims. I mean, the sort of line on expropriational compensation is nothing to see here. This is an outrageous thing. When the government introduces a law which allows it to confiscate people's property, regardless of race. So whether you're black, white, Indian, or colored, the state can take your stuff and give you nothing. While knowing, of course, that you have lots of race baiting that goes on, in the way that those sort of laws are promulgated and discussed. I think it's going to be used as a weapon against all sorts of ethnic minorities. I think one of the things that people assume is like, well, it'll just be the wise king who gets to do this, Roman Paul is a trustworthy guy. I'm sure he'll just pick just causes. But you've got 400 expropriating authorities around the country. And once MK starts getting control of municipalities in the next election, in KZN, and they say, that little piece of land looks quite nice, and you're not Zulu, so we don't think you really deserve to live there anymore. We don't really like vendors or Sutus or whatever being here, and it's in the public interest for us to confiscate your land and give us nothing. And if you don't like it, well, you can pay to take us to court. That's kind of a horrifying thing.
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know that.
Yeah. The scope of the law is pretty broad. One of the problems with it is that it gives examples of when no compensation can be paid, but it's not a closed list. So there's huge scope for uncertainty. And I mean, I saw an interview recently with an ANC politician where they were asked, well, when an international investor is thinking about investing in South Africa and they see the instability, they see the BE codes that they have to comply with, they're worried that the state will confiscate their property, what are you going to do to assure them? And the person said, go invest somewhere else. It's like, that's not a good answer. Like, we have a huge unemployment problem. We have a huge problem with being isolated by America because of all the nefarious things that we're up to. The answer is not go and invest elsewhere. It's we need to make some reforms. Please invest in South Africa, because then we can start uplifting people out of poverty. That's the right answer.
Absolutely. Veering a bit, you did a very interesting cross-examination of Mr. Malema. Do you want to talk about that? What was behind the scenes? What was your thought process there? Obviously, you plan all of that to get him to say what you want, and that was a good thing. But it was interesting how different communities took that response. Yeah. So,
I think people misunderstand what the nature of cross-examination is about. So you'll hear a couple of things that are interesting about this case. It's now finally been concluded. For a long time, I haven't been able to speak about it in enough detail. So I'll tell you some things that are kind of not really well known. The one is litigation has an element of improv theatre in it and an element of deep planning. So we knew who our witnesses were going to be. We structured it in such a manner that we could tell a coherent story about the impact of Kill the Boer, the environment in which the song is being sung, which is this sort of like terrible farm attacks. We led evidence from survivors. We led evidence from people who'd counseled communities that had gone through this. We led evidence from Ernst Ritz about the kind of the numbers. He's written this book, Kill the Boer. We didn't know if Julius would testify. So he didn't have to. We'd obviously brought the complaints against him and against the party and against Ndlozi, but it was open to him not to testify. And I think we ran for 9 days, and I think on day 6 we were told he'll testify. So the thought process was, what's going to be the approach? And the approach I thought that's important is, let's find out what his actual views are. So it's an 8-hour conversation over 2 days, really. The rules of the cross-examination are that you can't just stop barring a lunch break or a tea break. You have to be able to keep the cross-examination going. My approach was to think about topics that are important to discuss, to try and first of all understand the framework for the party. So the first hour or two is really understanding what does the FF actually believe, what are its foundations. They describe themselves as a Marxist-Leninist, Fananist organization. What does that entail? What are their views on property rights? What are their views on organizational structure? So one of the things that people say to me all the time is that I'm incredibly calm while doing it. And, Julius would do various things throughout.
Patronizing.
Yeah, they're quite aggressive. He would often say you to me when sort of referring to the client or to white people in general. So he would, try and dig at me. And I thought that was all fine because the distance between me being calm and him being irascible or, offensive was important. And showing the contrast was important. The other thing that I realized afterwards, so I worked on a case that relied on the state capture transcripts. And when I read through those transcripts, I saw what a lot of advocates would do. They would ask a question, they would get an answer. The answer wouldn't actually answer the question, but they'd say, okay, well, I asked my question, which I pre-prepared, so I guess I should move on to the next question. And so there's just this gaping hole in a lot of that evidence. My approach was not that. It was to think about topics. And my background's partly in philosophy. And philosophers are sort of like, you're either going to be a really fun dinner party guest or you're going to get booted out for doing things that are kind of seen as like pretty socially unaware. So one of the things that we do is when we ask a question, we expect honesty and clarity. And if we see an ambiguity, we keep teasing it out. And we ask kind of 3 questions more than anyone else would. And so my approach was often to say, okay, I don't think you've actually answered my question. Here's the ambiguities. Let's tease it out. And so I would keep pushing and keep pushing. I think the best example of me doing this well was saying to him, you have said that you're not calling for the slaughter of white people, at least for now. Would you pledge never to call for the killing of white people? And he says, I'll do it. Now, I could have stopped at that point and said, okay. So I said, oh, all right, well, you've said that you'll do this in principle, so will you do it now? And then he says, no, I refuse. So once I've gotten that answer, it's damning. That concession has been broadcast around the world millions of times. And it showed, someone who tries to make the claim, kill the Boer is this metaphorical thing, it doesn't have to do with killing people, then surely he would say, look, I would never call for the slaughter of white people, ever. Like, I'll make that pledge right now, immediately. I'll disabuse anybody of that false notion. So the refusal tells you what they really mean. There are many occasions where he says all sorts of like horrendous violent things, like you need killing in a revolution. When the time is right, we'll bomb the Union buildings.
Oh, wow, did he actually say that?
Yeah. So what's interesting about it, there's a sort of compilation video that Ronaldo Ghost tweeted out of about 8 minutes of just pure hatred from Julius. Lots of embracing of violence. He says violence is necessary. Colonialism was violent, so the only way to undo it is through violence. What was frustrating about running the matter, we have journalists in court with us every day. And so they'd sit there and they'd watch, these horrendous things coming out of Julius's mouth, and then they would ignore them. And so there's a compilation video from EWN, which is basically 10 minutes of Julius saying, rainbows and puppy dogs and butterflies and unicorns. And, so you kind of had this sense in which there were 2 narratives. My job as a cross-examiner is I'm basically building up a record of information for argument. So a lot of people would say, why aren't you arguing back with him? Why aren't you telling him that he's wrong? Like, why aren't you berating him? That's not the role of a cross-examiner. The role is to say, I need to find out what the evidence is. And then it's all in a written transcript. So when I argued it on the final day, you've got all of the things that are said. And so that could be digested by a court. And of course, because the thing was filmed by multiple people, you then have a record of it. It's an interesting case in that it's probably one of the best examples of the art of the losing case. That it is now globally famous. The fact that there was a loss there under circumstances that I think most people find absolutely bizarre shows not only a problem with singing Kill the Boer and saying that certain ethnic minorities are deserving of death and can be victimized, but also a sense in which people thought, well, the courts are the last bastion. Surely they'll apply the law equally. And I think a lot of people have reached out to me and said they've got a concern, especially with the Constitutional Court refusing to hear the matter, that they thought there's a problem. And I think it's a problem that's not been talked about for a long time because it's so uncomfortable to express concern about the courts. I think all of us see the decay in South Africa. We see the corruption. We see the potholes. We say, but at least we've got the Constitution. We've got these wonderful judges. And the story we haven't been paying much attention to is that the Judicial Services Commission, which picks judges, which Julius Malema sits on, has been a circus for a number of years. And I think most practitioners and many judges will accept that the kinds of questions that are asked of judges, the kind of judges who are excluded from elevation, or the kinds of candidates who are not welcome to become judges, often on very hostile racial grounds, that means that the kinds of people that are sitting on the bench are often, I think, afraid, often worried that if they did apply their minds in a way that was truly unbiased, that it would have repercussions for them in terms of, if you ever want to do debate at the Supreme Court, appeal the Constitutional Court, and make it very difficult. So we've politicized the courts in a way that's pretty unhealthy. Occasionally there's a bit of a backlash. So someone like Darlene Porfu was kind of renowned for political theatrics, eventually became a non-member of the JSC. But yeah, it's an important thing. I think also because these judges can play a role for quite a long time. We don't have, you're not there till you die, like in America. You have term limits, but you still play a big role in shaping the law. I think as well as we've become a more litigious society, and a lot of disputes get resolved through the courts, and often in a more public way, since the Oscar case, a lot of these things are filmed. It gives people an insight into how the sausage is made. The one thing that's good about the process is you have to give an answer and an explanation. You have to do it in writing. And there's some value in sort of seeing how the decision was reached, and then being able to say, hold on, there's a problem with that decision, or how it was achieved. So at least the public has some insight into it.
If you were in Julius Malema's shoes, do you think it's just so selfishness that he wasn't willing to pledge, that he never called for the genocide of white people? Do you think it's just, I'm not going to give this white guy what he wants? Do you think that was just it?
No, I think the impression I got throughout the cross-examination was he's caught between two pillars. On the one hand, don't want to be held liable for hate speech. On the other hand, if you come across as a moderate, you're going to lose your support base. So on many occasions, he says, I'm a radical, I'm a revolutionary. He wanted to amp up those credentials for his voter base and for the EFF crowd who were there as well. So every day outside of court, there was a crowd of EFF supporters who blockaded the entrance. So we weren't able to enter the court through the ordinary passage. They would sing Kill the Boer at us. They would mime shooting us. Just out of interest, the way that case started was a complete and utter denial that they ever sing Kill the Boer. They said, we sing Kiss the Boer. And then this kind of fell apart quite badly because, one, we had footage of them singing at Senegal, Kill the Boer, and this is in a criminal trial where a young farmer had been brutally murdered and his body was put on a pole. And then when we were at court, they would clearly sing Kill the Boer at us, and we filmed it. And so we, in the second day... So
that's not very strategic thinking.
No, we had a little trial within a trial. We said, look, here's evidence of them singing Kill while they maintain Kiss. Also, we need to be able to do our jobs here, and they're stopping us from doing this. There's a moment where we cross-examined one of the protesters, and I asked him a question, and he said, before I answer that, can I get some advice from my commander-in-chief over there? And the judge was like, no, you've got to answer. You can't get advice on this. So yeah, they suddenly dropped this idea of we only sing Kiss. And then very, very publicly sang Kill the Boer afterwards at mass stadiums and rallies. So I think he was caught between these two poles. I don't think it was about, not wanting to defer to me or something like that. He did run a lot of personal attacks against me, and I sort of many claims of, this guy's the weakest lawyer, that kind of stuff, and there were billboards saying this kind of thing. Every single online interview I've done since then, there will be some EFF bot. I guarantee there'll be ones on this video that say, is that the guy who Julius mopped the floor with? Isn't that the weakest lawyer? Isn't that guy like out of work nowadays? Doesn't he clean toilets for a living with his tongue? You know, it's like, yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah, well,
so,
there's a lot of people making a lot of money cleaning toilets.
yeah. So yeah, it's a sort of like, there's an online brigade of guys who either pay to do this, or this is what they do for fun, or whatever it is, sure. And I think the job of being a lawyer is, you know, you have to be able to do your job, even in the face of people hating you, and that's just what it is. You know, I take a strong view that you don't buckle in the face of pressure. One of the things that I found quite disturbing, so the day after our Kill the Boer trial, the case against Julius for discharging a firearm in public was supposed to start. And the prosecutor in that case resigned from the prosecution from the NPA and said, I don't want to go through what Mark went through. So that shows you the kinds of pressures that are put on lawyers. And it sort of made me realize, like, when you're in it and you're dedicated to that cause, and it was hard. I mean, one of the things that got us through it, every day during lunch, you know, we would crack jokes and we would sort of like try and conscript the situation and persevere. But not everyone can do it. And it can be quite a brutal thing on people.
Was there anything like, what do you call it, threats to you beyond like just voice? Did someone try to hit you? Something real serious?
I have had people try and hit me before. So I ran a case against Black First Land First. And it's a case that ran for a number of years. It was over Andile singing, every black person killed in taxi violence, not singing, sort of shouting at the crowd, we'll kill 5 whites, we'll kill their women, we'll kill their children, we'll kill their cats, we'll kill their dogs. So we ran I would think, the clearest hate speech case you could imagine on this. And during the trial, we led evidence of a witness, video evidence of a woman who described her husband being murdered in front of her while she was 9 months pregnant and taking the newborn child to the funeral. And the magistrate was quite touched by it, and during the proceedings, kind of a bit sort of teary-eyed. And we all sort of sat there in a bit of silence. And one of the BLF people said, why do I have to listen to this white bitch's tears? Wow. And so I looked at her and I said, you know, why don't you say that in the stand? And suddenly all the BLF guys stood up. One of the guys was probably about 6'9", like huge. And he just started charging at me. And so Ernst Rust was in court with me. And he had bodyguards with us. We often actually have to travel with bodyguards. And he thought, well, Mark's going to get punched in the face. I should at least get a video of it. So he took out his camera to sort of film the situation. And they then saw the camera and turned on him and tried to grab the phone, which they successfully did, but the bodyguard intervened and sort of held them off. So we have had physical altercations. As I say, with Kill the Boer, we had quite a lot of that, lots of them grabbing us or trying to take phones away from us, or, you know, verbal attacks, but it did get quite physical. During Kill the Boer, protesters came into court and sang Dibulu Bunu, something that my opponents and I said we've never seen ever. You know, it's like a completely outrageous thing to disrupt court proceedings like that. And the judge, I think, was quite disconcerted by it because it sort of also showed a failure in security. So,
sort of a controversial question, but genuine curiosity. We've attended like MK and EFF rallies where we literally film people singing Kill the Boer to us, right, dancing around us. Is that song really so bad? It's really, from a point of curiosity, is it really so bad? Is it, for the argument they make, it's sort of a struggle song. To put it now clearly to the audience, is there real concrete, I know you've already given some examples, but there's real clear causation between that song and actual killing of Boers?
Good question. So firstly, the test in our law is that you don't have to show a causal link. So the case on free speech and hate speech is a matter called Kwalani, which I ran at the Constitutional Court. So there, John Kwalani, the journalist, had written an article, the title, Call Me Names, but Gay is Not Okay. And in the article, he said, I pray that politicians would have the balls to change those parts of the Constitution that allow a man to marry a man and ditto a woman. And there was a cartoon attached with the article of a man marrying a goat. And he sort of made the claim that one day some idiot will claim that they have the right to marry an animal. So one of the questions that came up for the court was, is there a link between this article and homophobic violence? So evidence that was led in the trial was about the kind of environment that a lot of black lesbians, for example, lived within townships, that they would be victimized, that there would be corrective rapes. And so one of the questions was, well, do you have any evidence that anyone who read this article went and perpetrated a crime? They said, no, there's no evidence that shows that. And the court said, you don't need that kind of evidence. The purpose of expert testimony and things like that is really to show you the context in which the speech is uttered, but there's no requirement that you have to show the speech led to a crime. So, interestingly enough, Kill the Boer argued after Xolani, and we made it very clear when we were running the trial, we are not trying to make the claim that any person was killed because of the song, but we are telling you that the song is not innocuous, that, let's say, Kill the Boer is written in blood over dead people's bodies after they're murdered, that one of the questions is, so for it to be hate speech, you've got to advocate hatred against the group, and either incite harm against them, so call for harm to be perpetrated against them, or that the words themselves are significantly harmful. They demonstrate social division, they're like a deep psychological wound. And so one of the guys testified, he said, my wife was murdered next to me, I was shot and paralyzed, and whenever I hear anybody sing Kill the Boer, it reminds me of that occasion, and it's deeply psychologically distressing. So we had the kind of evidence of that. And the courts said, well, you couldn't prove a causal link, so I'm disqualifying all of your witnesses. And even the Supreme Court of Appeal said, well, that's not the right approach. There's no causal link requirement. So it's important to get the test right. And as I say, one could take a philosophical view, which is that we should basically allow all speech only under conditions where after the fact we can show the speech led to some violence, should we then punish it. That's not the choice that we've made in our law. And so it's very important that the law is applied consistently. Xolani's case changed one of the requirements in law. It used to be the case that hurtful speech was hate speech. That got struck out. But he was nonetheless held liable for hate speech for that article, under circumstances where it was clear there was no causal link. So it's important that we don't take the view that, while some groups get protection, other groups don't. And the signal that's being sent is that Afrikaners are not real people. They are not ordinary citizens who deserve protection, and you can say what you like about them. That's a horrifying signal to send.
I get that. I'm just worried that this turns into a white versus black thing. Sort of, I think perhaps the best way to look at this is not an appropriate thing to sing, but the majority of the people chanting it in this, I don't know how big the crowd is in these EFF rallies, do not really want to kill a white person, I assume.
I think it's hard to stare into someone's soul to find out what they really want to do. I think we've got other bits of evidence. As I say, when Julius testifies about killing in a revolution is important, that violence isn't off the table. That gives us evidence that, it's not just a song. That he also testified that, if they came into power, they would pass a law which would drive whites into the ocean. There's clearly a lot of racial animus. When I described some of these attacks to him, he refused to condemn them as being racist. He said they're just merely murder, despite, as I say, the sort of clear racial animus in what's written. It might very well be that for some people, it's just a struggle song. Kill the Boer, by the way, doesn't really have struggle credentials. So Dibulu Ibunu had some credentials. In 2011, the Quality Court had found that song mounted a hate speech. The addition of things like Kill the Farmer were later. They were seen as incredibly taboo for a long time. The Human Rights Commission had found its hate speech in 2003, as I say, Quality Court in 2011. You suddenly had this sort of shift in the Overton window, when the Kill the Boer case was run in the 2020s. So, there's a worry that standards aren't being applied evenly on these things. I mean, as I say, one could be a free speech absolutist and just say, look, if you want to say, kill all the blacks, cool, no problem. Kill all the Indians, no problem. We're just going to allow that kind of speech. You can chant it at rallies. You can be a powerful politician. You can have hundreds of thousands of supporters, no problem. But that's not the view that we take in our law, as I say, except when it comes to certain groups. And then there's a bending over backwards to try and explain why, what are Boers anyway? I've never heard of Boers. Like, Anglo-Boer, what war? What are you talking about?
Yeah. No, okay, I get the legal argument. I'm sort of more making I'm just worried this turns into a white versus black thing, because you see in the polling as well, a lot of Black South Africans don't really support the sanctions on ANC leaders. I think Social Research Foundation. So I'm just worried this turns now into a white versus black argument here in South Africa, and the progress, sort of quote unquote progress we have made, the little progress we have made, is stymied again.
On that front, so I did an interview on CakeNet recently, and one of my co-panelists, who I think had sort of like been a stalwart ANC member for a long time, said, look, the song is very counterproductive. It's immoral to sing it. It's very socially divisive. Most black people denounce the song and definitely don't want to inflame racial tensions. So I don't think it's really a black versus white thing. I think a lot of black people find it very distasteful, as do a lot of white people. I think it's much more an ideological thing. I think it's a party political thing. The ANC don't sing that song. They used to. They've denounced it. And most people have moved away from that kind of divisive language, barring the EFF, who will revel in it.
Yeah, well, great. I think it's just fringe and lunatics that still sing that song. UCT, what's going on there? I think I've lost track of the previous. What was the woman's name? The director or the chancellor? But I think the general state of that university, and many universities in South Africa, are collapsing with many of these dogmas from, I don't know if it originates here or come from the Western universities, but it's a problem in South Africa with these universities now falling into this leftist ideologies. Do you want to speak about that?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. So first is I'm a member of UCT's council, so I'm not speaking on their behalf, but I'll give you some insights that I have. I was an alumni of UCT, so I was there during a golden era without realizing it. From like 2002 to 2007, I studied philosophy and law. We had some of the greatest minds in the world. So David Benatar was my supervisor in philosophy. He's regarded as one of the greatest living philosophers. And he was also being driven out by the university and now lives abroad. Anton Fagan, who had trained under Joseph Raz, who had trained under Hart, these are like legal giants in jurisprudence, was my supervisor in law. Absolutely brilliant lawyer, one of the greatest in a generation, was forcibly retired. And I think he's the only professor at UCT in its over 100-year history to ever be denied emeritus status. So there are serious problems with the university. I think it's been there since the Fees Must Fall movement. I think people were naive in understanding what that movement was about. It started as Rhodes Must Fall, and the feeling was when we see a statue of Cecil John Rhodes, we find it very wounding. It's akin to having to walk past a swastika. Students had actually, an interesting demonstration of this, had put up swastikas and pictures of Hitler without any context. And when people complained about it, they said, well, we did it not because we're anti-Semites, but because we want you to understand what it feels like when you walk past Rhodes. And the view was, we understand why you've used these symbols. So, I don't believe in treating words and symbols like in a blasphemy way. I think you should look at the context, and I think they were trying to illustrate a point. But the thought was, if we just take down the statue of Rhodes, that'll end it. But actually all it did was open up the floodgates, because really the agenda there was decolonization, which is this very nebulous term. What does it mean to decolonize the university? Well, if you take it very seriously, it means removing all Western influences at the university. So think about all the books that are taught from Europe. They must be vanquished. We need to remove Roman Dutch law and English law. I, as a joke, started a fake university called Saki Bartman University. And we offered a decolonized law degree. And so, of course, we removed all the English law courses, all the Roman Dutch law courses. And unfortunately, the African customary law courses had been tainted by the colonizers, so we had to remove those as well. So to get your law degree was quite simple. You just printed off a certificate. Now, what's sort of grim about this joke was the number of people who didn't see it as a joke. And I got a lot of genuine inquiries if this sounds like a great thing. I picked Saki Bartman for a reason as well, which is that at UCT's library, the work of art that they were most proud about when I was there was a statue of Saki Bartman made by the artist Willie Bester. Now, Willie is like one of these once-in-a-generation sculptors, came up with this incredible way of making art where he would take car parts and other bits of like used machinery and weld them together. And so you have this incredible mechanical Saki Bartman. So Saki Bartman, for those that don't know, was a Khoisan woman who was taken to France, sort of paraded around, and her body remained in France until eventually the French government returned her body to the Khoisan people. And it was seen as this important recognition of racial abuse that happened in South Africa. What the Fallists did when they saw this was to cover the body in basically a burqa, to say that any depiction of a black body is racist and unacceptable, and they censored the sculpture, and it was sort of hidden away. It took an American librarian to ask, sorry, is the work of art meant to have this covering over it? And someone said, kind of sheepishly, no, the students put it there. So he uncloaked her. The statue remains sort of hidden. Although, interestingly enough, the main hall at UCT used to be called Jamison Hall, and is now called Saki Bartman Hall. So, yeah, interesting shenanigans at UCT. I think that decolonization project has meant that, you've had a big overhaul on the curriculum. A lot of brilliant scholars have left the university. And you mentioned, American universities having an influence on us, and I think they have. I think a lot of this stuff is around, critical race theory, which in an American context is maybe partly about protecting minority rights, whereas in South Africa, you've got a very different kind of population dynamic. So it's actually about eradicating minorities. We've sort of imported some bad ideas from the Americans and exported some of our bad ideas. So, toppling Rose's statue led to toppling statues in the UK and all over America. So we've had this kind of like toxic dialogue between the universities. You mentioned the prior Vice-Chancellor, Mamokgethi Phakeng, who kind of resigned, I think, in some sense of disgrace over, a range of scandals at the university. There's a new Vice-Chancellor, Mosa Moshabela, who I think is really trying his best to get the academic project back on board. And I think he's hamstrung by various elements of the university, and I think that makes his life quite difficult. One of the things that's made his life very difficult is that the council, before I took up a seat, adopted a boycott which had been proposed by the Senate of Israeli academics, in particular academics who have IDF affiliations. So instead of saying, like, we will not cooperate with any academic who's involved in human rights abuses or from a nation like that, or who serves in the military of any nation, they've specifically targeted Israel quite soon after October 7th, which is a horrifying thing to do after that nation endured the worst terror attack in its history and the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, to then, side with the kind of those who are sympathetic to Hamas, I think is a sort of dangerous thing. The campus has had a number of, let's say, terrorist sympathizers on campus. So people have worn shirts that say, "We are Hamas," or "Hamas the Resistance." They've surrounded Jewish students and screamed at them like, "We are Hamas." There's a case of a Jewish student who had his yarmulke knocked off his head. So they've entertained people from Hezbollah and the Houthis on campus. So there's a sense in which they have allowed very dangerous elements onto campus, and it's having repercussions.
Just out of curiosity, why do you think that is such an emotive and, I don't know, you could probably say religious, it's because of religion, but it's a very emotive issue, this entire Israel-Palestine thing. It's extremely, a lot of people take it extremely seriously, even though they're in South Africa. Do you think it's just primarily religion that people get so energized about that issue thousands of miles away?
I think religion plays a role, but I think there's more going on because the Muslim community in South Africa has often gone on quite well with the Jewish community in South Africa. I spoke to someone who told me that he's in his 70s, his father trained as a lawyer, and during apartheid was looking for articles, and the only firms who would entertain him were Jewish firms. And so there has been cooperation over time. I think what we've had is this narrative that Israel is an apartheid state, and apartheid is bad, and South Africans have endured apartheid, and so we must condemn Israel. There's a very famous example of a SASCO guy, so an ANC guy who was at WITS, and he'd actively participated in Israel Apartheid Week, condemned Israel as an apartheid state, and someone said to him, "Well, have you ever been?" He said, "No." He said, "Well, why don't you come and have a look for yourself?" And he did a trip, and he wrote an article, and he said, "I've spent some time in Israel, and I am filled with disgust because I've been lied to." He said, "My whole life, I've been told that Israel is an apartheid state, and I've realized that this has been used as a political device to disenfranchise a place that is multiracial, A lot of people think that all Jews look like Woody Allen, but if you go to Israel, you'll see that you've got black Jews from Ethiopia, you've got Arab Jews from the north of Africa, from Yemen, from Iraq, from Morocco, who all had to flee their homes, and find refuge in Israel. That there are people of all different religions who live in Israel. So you've got Arab Israelis who are Muslim, who are in parliament, who are judges. You've got Druze and Christians. And inside Israel, you have a lot of cooperation between these groups. There's no separate, separate benches, Jews only stuff. Whereas if you go into Gaza, there are no Jews. If you go into a lot of those countries that surround Israel, there are no Jews. There is a sense in which there is extreme hostility towards non-Muslims. There are very few Christians who live in those countries as well. I think we've politicized it, and that's why South Africans have gotten on board with this. I think, for example, the ICJ case against Israel is incredibly misguided, and the way that it was reported on by our press is Team South Africa is on the global stage, like we're watching a soccer match or a rugby match. And I think really they were perpetrating a blood libel. And I think it's ultimately a case that will be lost by the South Africans. I don't think they'll ever be able to demonstrate genocide under conditions of a defensive war. I think universities generally should take a view on statements about political matters, which is that you should stay out of it. I think it's fine to have scholarship on it. So if your academics want to teach courses about Israel and Palestine, if they want to express a particular view on it, they should be totally free to do so. I think academic freedom is really important on that front. But the university as an institution generally shouldn't be making statements about political matters that fall out of its purview. Firstly, it's ineffective. So do you think anybody cares about UCT's stance on Israel-Gaza conflict? No. Gazans don't care, the Israelis don't care. It's an irrelevancy. It's a sort of virtue signal in one direction, and one that is going to cost them dearly. So a lot of donors have said we can't be associated with the university that condemns the only democracy in the Middle East that allows for anti-Semitism to happen on campus. So they've lost hundreds of millions of rands. They're funding from NIH, and this is the National Institute of Health in America. UCT is the largest beneficiary outside of America, as they have been told that you are in danger of losing this funding, and are already starting to have programs shut down. So this would be very difficult for the university. They'll lose hundreds of staff. The sort of projection is between 200 and 400 members of staff who are doing quite important work in infectious diseases. So the ramifications of this boycott have been dramatic. Also been just very divisive for the university, that it's an issue that has consumed so much attention instead of being able to focus on what are our students learning, how do we make this a good environment, how do we ensure that the campus looks nice. It's been a real shame. I mean, the Vice Chancellor gave a public talk to alumni in Johannesburg recently, and he expressed this concern that UCT is still ranked the top university in Africa and in South Africa, and he's worried that with our financial support it will dwindle and become the lowest ranked university and dilute everybody's degrees, and it'd be like a crying shame for this institution that's been around for well over 100 years.
They're probably worried, taking a stance on this, what happened with Rhodes Must Fall, that same thing will happen again. All of a sudden, you'll get these protesters and whatever saying, no, you should continue talking about Palestine and Israel, and you're not allowed to do that. So they're probably making that calculation, okay, what do we do?
Yeah, I think there are ways to do this fairly. So I think academic freedom matters. I think free speech matters. So I think it's fair to recognize that protests on campus is a form of free speech. And so you should generally allow a lot of discussion, but you can have time, place, and manner restrictions. So just because you're allowed to protest doesn't mean you're allowed to protest while someone else is giving a lecture. Doesn't mean you're allowed to do it, outside of an academic's office to threaten them. Doesn't mean that you're allowed to firebomb the Vice Chancellor's office like happened during Rhodes Must Fall. Doesn't mean you're allowed to, shout down people or cancel academics who've been invited by the university to speak. I think you should have good faith discussions on these things. And one of the things that's sort of horrifying, universities are meant to be a place of exchange of ideas, ivory towers where you can sort of entertain weird and wonderful thoughts. I would think that it'd be very hard for someone to take a pro-Israel view, on a campus in South Africa or abroad as well, for someone to explain what Zionism is in neutral terms without being called, an apartheid apologist or a colonizer or, something along those lines. And I think universities would be very uncomfortable with hosting those discussions. And that's a really bad thing. What you want is for both sides to be able to express their views, to have civil debates, to be able to write papers, to be able to teach classes without interruption, without threats. Then you know that you've got a thriving academic environment. And I don't think we have that. Dennis Davis recently hosted a discussion at the Franschhoek Literary Festival, where he said he doesn't think that campuses would be a place that would host that kind of open dialogue on these questions, and that's all right.
Judge Dennis Davis.
Judge Dennis Davis.
And I mean, he's also seen as somewhat of a left-leaning person. So
very much so.
So a person like that saying that's damning.
Yeah, I would think so. He was moderating a discussion between Milton Shane, who was at UCT in the Kaplan Center and is the expert on anti-Semitism, and Deep Fried Man's dad, Stephen Friedman. So Stephen Friedman's project is partly me to say when anyone cries anti-Semitism, you shouldn't take them seriously. And that the signal is really, if someone's anti-Semite, they're actually just anti-West. I think it's true that people who are anti-Semites often are very anti-West, and they see Israel as a sort of like Western outpost in the Middle East, and they don't like it being there, like to see it eradicated, and they're very hostile to Western interests. But nonetheless, I think they also hate Jews. And I think a lot of people who say, "Oh, I don't hate Jews, I just hate Israel." It's like, okay, well, are you hostile to any other ethnic group who has their own state? Do you hate, the Greeks for having Greece? No. It seems like, I mean, even if let's say you're say I only care about one group of people on earth. I only care about Palestinians. Okay, so well, if you only care about Palestinians, did you say anything when they were slaughtered by the Jordanians in the 1970s? When they were killed by the Syrians, when they were kicked out of Lebanon, when they were treated badly by the Egyptians. Have you said a word about any of this stuff? No. Okay, well then maybe you don't like Palestinians. Not that, you care about them as a group, you just hate Jews.
And I think also Egypt sealed its borders. I mean, nobody's really talking about that, but the Egyptians don't want them to come into their country.
I mean, there's a great example of this. Douglas Murray got invited on EWN to talk to Jane Dutton. And, she sort of said the usual platitudes about, Israel's obviously an apartheid colonial settler state and, blocking the Palestinians and, keeping them in this open-air prison. It's really terrible. And he said, well, have you ever been to the region? She says, well, I work for Al Jazeera, so I was in Dubai, but I've never visited Israel. And he says, are you aware that, the Egyptians maintain a border crossing there? And so if the Egyptians opened that up, the Palestinians would be free to go into Egypt, and they deliberately block that, and they, ensure they don't, because the Egyptians are very worried about terrorist groups operating in the Sinai. And she then tried to change the topic. What's amazing about that interview, where Douglas says, no, we're not changing the topic, let's have a proper conversation about this, EWN refused to air it. And so the interview was surfaced and published by Douglas. And, much to, I think, Jane Dutton's chagrin.
I would love to hear your opinion on this. I recently made a video calling for a new CODESA. And the intent of that is it seems all our problems originate in the Constitution. It's not sort of a feely document, not really practical. And we need to get together and just say, okay, that was fun. Let's just rewrite this thing now with Afrikaner interests at heart, all the communities, and relook at the electoral system, federalism, because to rework that entire thing will be quite a nightmare to make all the changes the political parties are proposing. So what do you think of that? Is that even viable? Is that completely a pipe dream?
Over the years, have heard many people point out the defects in the Constitution, and it's not a perfect document, and have said, we should make some changes. And John Ken Berman, who was the old CEO of the Institute for Race Relations, pointed out some of the socioeconomic rights in the Constitution, and how they're destabilizing and create these huge burdens on the states, and we should have a more libertarian Constitution. And I said to him, if we engage in a constitutional change project, those aren't the rights that are going to fall away. It'll be the property rights clause. And, I said this to him about 15 years ago. And unfortunately, I was right. The only attack on a right in the Bill of Rights was against the property clause. So I think we must accept that the Constitution was a negotiated document, negotiated under conditions of uncertainty. It was unclear what the electoral outcomes would be when it was negotiated in 93. You obviously had a final Constitution that comes out in 96. there's a sense in which you can have the best document on earth, but if it's not being protected by institutions or interpreted in good faith, you're going to have problems. And I think a lot of the language that was used in that document was a result of compromise without people realizing what they were compromising on or who would be doing the interpreting. I would imagine that if you were to produce a new constitution now, that it would be a lot worse than the one that we have. And so I think there's a danger in inviting that project. But I'm with you on where you need some reforms. So I think there's a danger in having a highly centralized government. I think localizing would be very good. I think we have pockets of excellence in South Africa that work very well and often are impeded by a national government. So, for example, we assume that each province or each city has its own police because you see JMPD going around. They're not a police force, they're traffic cops. So you have SAPS, the National Police Force, that's not able to respond to the particular needs of particular communities. You often have clashes in Cape Town between their local kind of metro cops and the national cops. So I think here's a kind of radical idea about Johannesburg. So you're dealing with this center of commerce for the continent. Joburg has this incredible commercial history. So many brilliant businesses have formed here, and it is a city on the ropes. It's drive around. There's potholes everywhere. There's water shortages, electricity shortages. One way to save Joburg is to get rid of the city of Johannesburg. And what I mean is to sort of return not even that far back in time. So in 2000, there used to be a mayor of Sandton. Used to have a whole bunch of different districts. And I think those smaller districts are manageable, that the people inside that community can sort of look after each other and say, we want our area to work. It's important to us that we're able to elect our own officials, produce our own bylaws, and ensure that our tax revenue goes towards, our locale. What you have at the moment is this megalopolis. Johannesburg's 8 million people. It's bigger than some countries in Europe. And it's just incredibly badly managed. So one solution for Johannesburg would really be to dissolve Johannesburg as an administration and have a variety of different administrations. You'd then have much greater levels of accountability. You'd probably see vast improvements in certain areas. And some areas would have to work out okay, do we care about Malaysia and Soweto? We need to make this work. We can't count on being cross-subsidized by Sandton. Interesting enough, I expressed this view to someone who's an ex-EFF parliamentarian. She's like, brilliant idea, we should definitely do this. I'm sick of cross-subsidizing people in other neighborhoods. So, yeah, I think...
It's fascinating speaking to Action SA, Good. They're all sort of on board with this sort of ideas. These sort of get rid of these provincial, devolve everything to a municipality or get it to a local, much more local municipality. Many of them like these sort of ideas. It's fascinating to me.
I think part of it as well is, as a politician, you think, if I can have some place where I can make a name for myself, I've got a chance if we sort of divvied up areas. It might very well be that we've had 2 Al Jamar mayors in Joburg because of our sort of weird division of things. But it could be that, you could have an Al Jamar with a mandate running out of Lenasia, and you could have a DA with a mandate running out of the northern suburbs of Joburg, and you could have an ANC with a mandate running this inner city. So, yeah, there's a sense in which these coalition governments are very difficult, and, you can deal with paralysis at a national level. I think it's not necessarily a bad thing when they're not promulgating all these bad laws. But at a city level, when it's about actually getting things done, the paralysis can be really, really bad for the citizens. And so having people who've got a mandate who can run something smaller, better, swifter would be a very good thing. One of the things that people have often talked about in South Africa for electoral reform is that we should have a constituency system. And my concern has always been about gerrymandering. So what you find in the States and the UK is that the popular vote often looks very different from, the party that wins. So Reform UK or UKIP, would get a lot of popular support and a very small number of seats. And I'd say, well, one reason to avoid that in South Africa is to avoid the gerrymandering, because those who are in power will divvy things up. It was pointed out to me that we've already had a gerrymandering project when it came to building the metros, that you artificially conglomerated certain areas in with a lot of ANC supporters to ensure that certain areas would be run by the ANC. And so I think we must recognize that and roll back time a little bit. It's not an apartheid project, actually. It's sort of early New South Africa project where you had smaller areas being governed by people that really cared about that area and lived in that area.
Do you know that if there's a way to reframe that in a better way? Because a lot of people think apartheid. If they say decentralization or federalism or stuff like that, you're trying to bring back the Bantustans or apartheid. Is there a way to, I don't know, or is it just the media pushing that? Does the average person, okay, that actually makes sense?
Yeah, I think there are very few people who hanker for apartheid in South Africa. No one is saying, let's bring back apartheid. It's just not a cause being championed by anybody. The ANC have tried to say that about the DA for a very long time. They're going to bring back apartheid. Very weird thing, given that the DA's roots were in the Progressive Federal Party, and that one of the only people speaking out against apartheid for 13 years on her own was Helen Suzman. So strange libel to run at them. And now that the DA and the GNU, it's kind of hard to sort of say like, okay, we're with the apartheid guys. So I think what you've got to do is say, look, what are actually good political systems to have in place? There's nothing necessarily pernicious about decentralization. I mean, one of the things you've got to recognize about apartheid as well was that you had a lot of state control. It was not a hyper-capitalist society. You had like price controls. You had, the state in your bedroom and in your bookshop. And, this is not a place that was like, oh yeah, let a whole bunch of, people live their lives of their choosing.
Yeah.
The way the Bantustans were set up was illegitimate. Like, I think you had genuine self-governance, if you had a sense of people saying like, I want to be able to chart a path on my own, as opposed to being this sort of like, fake apartheid apparatchik sort of thing. I think there's room for good ideas that work in other countries and working on how we do that. If you look at Switzerland, for example, it's highly democratic at a local level. So you have cantons, people go into the town square and they vote with the staff. I don't think anybody could tell me who the Swiss president was. They don't have that sort of, national sort of status. There's a sense in which your local community matters. There's still some sense of a Swiss culture, although it's also very, multilingual place. People speak English and German and Italian and French. South Africa is similar in that way. We're, a nation of minorities.
And you, any future prospects, projects you're working on that you want to talk about, that you're excited about?
Yeah, so one of the things that I get to do is run a philosophy discussion show called Brain Debat. We've been running for the last 5 years. It's one of the great joys of my life, being able to summon up some brilliant thinker and ask them whatever I want for an hour. The wonderful thing about philosophers is they really care about the truth, are not afraid of disagreement, see disagreement as a tool to find out what's true. So we've had hard conversations in a very civil way with people on a variety of topics. Some of them are moral topics, political topics. A lot of them are sort of like deep existential topics, like do you have free will? How should we understand the nature of minds? So should we think about AI as being like akin to persons? Are they just machines? Are we just machines in some sense? So I ran it with a guy called Jason Werbelov, got a PhD in philosophy and is also a sci-fi writer, a very successful entrepreneur. Most of our guests are American. So we're one of the most well-known philosophy shows in the States. We're ranked like 15 in the world. In South Africa, if anyone ever recognizes me from Brain Debat, I'm like absolutely delighted about it. Most of the time sort of people think, oh, there's Jan van Riebeck who was in the Kill the Boer case.
The failed lawyer.
Yeah.
Doing the cleaning. And
the guy who cleans toilets for a living while looking like Jan van Riebeck, So actually, I'm just the amateur philosopher. So yeah, if you're interested in that, check out Brain Debat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for your time.
Absolute pleasure.